Good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you, Raghu. And of course, I'd like to thank the BIC for making my fables part of the celebrations in this Children's Month of November. Uh, BIC has put together a wide spectrum of events in this context, and I hope mine will measure up. Thank you all as well for moving to your computer on this sunny Sunday afternoon, or actually it's still morning. So, what is it? I'd just start with a little introduction until people sort of fill in to their computers. So I'd start by asking a question. What is it that makes fables so appealing to children and adults alike? Now, for a start, they are set in an unconventional reality, one of disbelief, yet of vague familiarity. For the child, a refuge in the imagination. And for the adult, perhaps an escape from the humdrum. And a yearning, no doubt, for perhaps a lost childhood. Fables intentionally expand the imagination of children. They distort time and space, as well as logic, scale, and proportion. Things we architects sometimes do unintentionally. They also contain a dreamlike quality that is second nature to children. This quality, not always easy to evoke, making writing for children, well, that much more difficult. There were two reasons in the last few years that motivated me into writing the Architecture Fables. One, Fausto Gilberti's The Ogre That Ate Children. Yes, the ogre that ate children. It is a surrealist storyteller's interpretation of the fable so bizarre that my daughter refused to let me present it to my young grandchildren. So I thought, if it seemed okay in a book for an ogre to eat humans, actually, to be fair, he ate only greedy children, then why not inanimate beings made of brick and mortar, concrete and glass? It's then that the seed of the idea was sown. The other reason was receiving a brilliant version of the book by Lewis Carroll, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. This was the 150th anniversary edition with breathtaking drawings by the maestro surrealist himself, Salvador Dali. It is a sort of a treasure, this book, published in 2015. So one might say that is how the idea of the architectural fables came into bloom. The two fables I'm going to read today are part of a book of 5 fables, the Architecture Fables for Children. It takes a long and serious look at the discipline of architecture, warts and all. I use at times a kindly wide-angle lens, at times a critical microscope. But the purpose is always to challenge the present, the status quo, by exploring the possibilities for change. Historically, the fable has gone as far as to incite dissent, rebellion, and even revolution. Animal Farm, George Orwell's classic fable written in 1945, being a case in point. But, well, I haven't gone that far. The fables go across all aspects of the discipline: architectural practice, academia, conservation, and construction. The fifth is called not architecture online, that is the COVID phenomena we are facing, but architecture on the line, set in the distant future, perhaps in 2084, 100 years after 1984, George Orwell's well-known book. The mirror I use is not a flat, conventional one. It is slightly either convex or concave to make people see, because they usually only look. I shall read the fables on practice and on academia. For the other 3, well, you'll have to buy the book to be out early next year. The illustrations are not part of this reading as such, though they might be just 2 slipped in. They are being done by a young student of mine who has an incredibly fluid hand and an imagination to match. He is in the process of breathing life into ogres, spiders, lizards, bats, owls, crows, strays, and sundry humans. Often humans come away looking rather foolish and inadequate. Before I start, let me make a disclaimer. All life forms, including humans, buildings, and places in these fables are fictional. Any perceived likenesses are entirely coincidental. But of course, the imagination will construct for you the familiarity of the oft trodden and the atmospherics of the familiar, I do hope. So I'll start reading the first of the fables, which is the title of the book, The Ogre That Ate Ugly Buildings. And it's on architectural practice. In a village made famous by artists, dreamers, and fabulists lived an invisible ogre. Although none had actually seen him, they all felt his presence, like we feel the wind, but do not see it. He was known for gobbling up old abandoned buildings that their owners had left to decay. No one knew where and when those ruins disappeared, but they were there one day and gone the next. It was for very long an unexplained mystery. Those who lied about having seen the ogre at his work said his head was a large and noble looking copper dome, and his eyes wide circular windows with mica shades emanating a deep green light. Were they lasers that turned masonry into crumbs? Or since he worked at night, just lamps aiding night vision? Anyways, it was enough for him to be dubbed the Green Ogre, or Groggy for short. But other liars, and there were many of these in that village, claimed that he had a black, brainless, flat head with two long ears like pigtails. He looked like he had just received a diploma, perhaps fake, for deconstruction. In plain speak, take to pieces. From his deep-set eyes, like narrow cylindrical tunnels, emanated the red flames of hellfire, they said. Perhaps he used these flames to cook up his meals? But these liars couldn't come up with any catchy name, so Groggy stuck, and appropriately so. He devoured his lifeless prey with clinical precision, always feeling groggy or lighter in the head after devouring a few stones, bricks, or some broken wooden frames. But after a few years, Groggy was beginning to get restless and bored. Life in the village wasn't exciting, let alone challenging, for his unusual skill and appetite. He was also aware of people's newfound desire to bring new life to old ruins. Restoration and conservation, these words were most often heard in the village. Those who had allowed their buildings to decay were now returning to reclaim and restore them. So it became necessary for Groggy to reinvent himself, to survive. With little or no sustenance for his enormous belly, he decided to relocate to a city across the state. A beautiful city, but a terrible place, as a master architect had once described it, and other cities as well. So we don't know really where this is set. There he had a cousin sister called Moxie. She was invisible too, and had lived for years on carbon dioxide that was in abundance in her city, as well as on acid rain, just like the trees did. Cleaning the air gave her the right, she thought, to consider herself a carbon warrior. And why not, when they were urban evangelists, urban activists, and green warriors doing the rounds? But she was much more than an activist. She had this acute aesthetic sense that could differentiate between ugliness and beauty, between real and fake. And that she would put most trained professionals to shame. When he arrived at Moxie's, she took him around to show all the terrible buildings being built in our once beautiful city. It seemed that all that mattered now was money and more money. And all the stakeholders were ready to go to any length chasing it. It was unbearable, the ugliness spread in the name of architecture, she said. One of the oldest and most noble professions taking such a beating. Moxie had decided to put an end to this, to set things right. She had a plan, and Groggy would play an important role in it. Sometimes she went into verse. Building for infamy and greed was the hallmark of this breed. Many of them were leg in boot, ever ready for a share of the loot, she told Groggy, speaking of the people who built them. She spoke little, and when she did, she usually spoke in verse. For them, the city and its people didn't seem to matter. What did was seeing their money bundles getting fatter, she concluded. She had also a wonderful sense of humor and an endearing turn of phrase. Not hand in glove, but leg in boot, imagine. Moxie had this devious plan for her cousin's survival, and it was intertwined with the future of her city. And it was all coming into focus in her head, and he didn't know about it. She was as clever as Groggy was brainless. But she knew that with her good planning and aesthetic sense and his muscular brawn, they would make a formidable duo of carbon warriors. She was, in a sense, declaring war on the ugliness of the city. You will partly eat only the ugly buildings, she told Groggy, after I tell you which. Don't go as far as those ruins you had attacked in your village. Just nibble at them, but show your signature. Let's be more than just mere green activists. We shall be true blue urban guerrillas, she told them. But of course, she was too smart to take all these labels seriously. She had a job on hand, and to finish it was her plan. But they had to find a way because to these carbon warriors, people mattered. They might be ogres, but ogres with heart. No accidents, she said. Eating away ugly buildings was a stock in trade, their livelihood. So Moxie's plan was to work at night or on long weekends, making sure all occupants were safe and away. And to be doubly sure, they raised fire alarms so those still inside would scamper out. They started their late dinner around midnight or the very early hours of the morning, and they went about it very methodically, leaving the better parts intact. And as much as Moxie loaded these glass sheets on those clinical facades, she and Groggy loved its taste the most. It was as crunchy to them as a juicy bone was to a street dog, and there was an overabundance of it, something beyond both Groggy and Moxie's understanding. Groggy's village diet had almost no glass in it, and you observed that he did not have to heat it. It was already preheated. Advanced food technology, he thought. But Moxie's explanation was spot on. She had the humor. People are idiots, she said. Instead of making hay where the sun shines, they put glass where it does. Let them sweat, the ignorant fools, she told herself. And lo and behold, when people started returning to work after the weekend, they found a half demolished building, as if literally eaten by monsters. And before you could say Moxie or Groggy, others began noticing it as well. Understandably, the city was in turmoil. How could buildings partly disappear or suddenly get half eaten away? What did they do wrong? Did they start construction on the wrong day, the wrong time? Did the professionals and contractors get together to cook up an unholy collusion? Too many questions, but no answers. In the meantime, more and more streets across the city had a war-torn look, with sometimes debris left strewn all over the roads. A state of emergency was called. The city council met to get to the bottom of this debacle. They had to find a way to save their buildings and the extended cityscape. They had gone through numerous viruses in the past, all attacking humans or animals: swine flu, Ebola, HIV, and most recently COVID 19. But a virus eating at inanimate objects, buildings, unimaginable. They hadn't yet realized that there were invisible ogres at work and that only ugly buildings were being targeted. They would know in good time. The city council chambers were predictably filled with hundreds of architects and builders, all flaying their arms in protest, and thousands of angry citizens outside, unable to go to work. Save our buildings, they implored. Save our city, they cried. For the recently appointed young and visionary mayor, this was virtually a baptism by fire, an Agni Pariksha. But she held her fort, bringing the house quickly to order. Yes, you could have heard a pin drop, such was her charisma. Why is it, she asked, that on the main streets only some buildings have been attacked and some not? I've been doing some deep thinking about it, and I see that some method to this madness. She was, after a long time, an upright official who called a spade a spade. She hated some of these buildings that had been half devoured. With her uncanny sixth sense and unique ways of seeing, she had put two and two together. And she continued, like the little boy pointing to the emperor with no clothes, she told the professionals gathered around her. Those buildings being attacked are ugly and have broken all the rules. The city seems to have found a digital cleansing system. Some unseen hand, she said, has devised a new software, Auto Deconstruct, which is waging a quiet war on the ugliness of the city. The professionals could not believe her. They cried foul and they cried hoarse, but they did not have a counter argument. They regrouped and approached their council, which was in the capital city. The destruction hadn't gone national yet, but in time, this was being anticipated. Some demonic plague had hit the profession and it could spread. Never a crisis like this since the first architect, Vitruvius the Roman, over 2000 years ago. The council also pondered over the observations of that upright mayor in that severely afflicted city. There was definitely a pattern. Ugly buildings were not being spared. The better ones survived. And whoever was doing this knew the difference. They had to investigate before things got out of hand. In the meantime, there was a quiet panic in a western city on the Pacific Ocean. Thousands of expats living there were deeply concerned. Their city back home was being systematically destroyed by what they heard was a 3D software virus called auto deconstruct. Even the software parks they did work with weren't spared. Nobody had yet heard of Groggy or Moxie. With all the sophisticated tools and skill at their disposal, they had to find an antidote to this plague, a 3D software vaccine. All the king's horses and all the king's men had to put architecture together again. And ASAP, that was their challenge. The heads of major companies, many originally from the beleaguered, helpless city, went into a powwow. It wasn't easy, but they worked ceaselessly. Finally, after many frustrating weeks, they devised a program called Auto Reconstruct. The app made it possible for the concerned professionals to go back to their drawing board, to their design software, and redesign their work to be worthy of the city. Some were arrogant and refused. How dared anyone suggest their work inferior, they screamed. But the writing was clearly on the wall. Their buildings weren't architecture at all. And if they really wanted them to reappear, they'd have to abandon arrogance and concur. Let's agree. The less arrogant ones complied. They diligently reworked their ideas to make their buildings worthy of the occupants in the city at large, something they had carelessly overlooked earlier. Overnight, the modified buildings reappeared on the street. Groggy, meanwhile, was tiring of digesting so much toxic architecture. It was too much for him to stomach. Moxie wasn't helping him much either. She had no taste for garbage. And the glass that Groggy so enjoyed at the start was doing him in. In his village, he always had a healthy diet. Laterite, timber, and tiles were his mainstay, all organic. He now fed on inorganic fast foods. Glass, especially, was cutting into his insides, with the result that he was losing both his invisibility as well as his invincibility, because he was fatigued, he was tired. He had to stop and return to his village to recoup. Moreover, the 3D software developed by the expat Pacific IT evangelist seemed to be working. And soon, all architects came on board, even the snooty protesters. And the city, like those humiliated architects, was given a second chance and a brand new look. But no one could rest assured. Groggy and Moxie had only taken a sabbatical, an extended break. During their absence, somehow their story leaked into social media. Some architect from Groggy's village had come to the city for a conservation symposium called Reimagining Ruins. He spoke about the village fable of the disappearing ruins and how the village folk attributed to Groggy the ogre. It turned out to be greedy speculators erasing the marks of antiquity, of history. But the parable of the city being cleansed of its ugliness? I guess not everything can be explained. Was it just one big collective dream shared with citizens by the city founder from beyond, concerned that things were going beyond repair? Or a nightmare hypnotically induced through social media sometime in the future? A replay of Orwell's 1984 in 2034 after 50 years? The whole episode, lasting 5 weeks, made social media go into overdrive and the profession into deep introspection, deep thinking. Never again would architects take their city and its citizens for granted. The moral of this fable is very clear for all of us to see. In reality, an architect gets one chance, not two or three. So don't wait for the ogre inside you to tap on your door. He tapped on mine, and I'd say that was quite a blow. So that's the end of the groggy ogre with his cousin Moxie. The second fable that I read, the first was on practice. This is on academia, on teaching, and it's called The Spider That Came to the Jury. Uh, as most architects, know, there are now over 500 schools of architecture in the country, and most are not in large cities, but in small towns. When I went to architecture school, there were less than 10. So you can imagine in the last, well, close to half a century, how the schools have multiplied 50 times over. So this fable has come from the thing of the difficulty of getting serious tutors to cross over. It's really difficult. Even when they succeed, these tutors have to confront the establishment, but require them to literally interpret the curriculum. Most leave disillusioned, and the students, of course, lose out. So the backdrop for this fable, again, it is in the middle of no. I mean, it doesn't have a specific city, but it's in one of these Mufassil areas. One of these small towns where I think there's always this problem with faculty, students, establishment. But it can happen in any school. We've learned from COVID that it doesn't spare anybody. This is a story of three unusual friends, a spider, a lizard, and a bat. They were perched late one night on the steel frame ceiling of an architecture school studio. This is a large room where how to make buildings is taught. They loved to get together after the nocturnal bat returned briefly for the night. Although exhausted and not particularly dying with curiosity, the bat nevertheless enjoyed listening to the continuous banter of his two friends. There was a lot that went on within the studio over the day, they said, and insisted on him knowing it all. The moods of the tutors, the wily nature of the students, and the furtive glances and messages they exchanged between them, all quite intriguing. Of course, the nature of the conversations in the studio appealed to them as well. The two had, after all, been brought up in academic and artistic surroundings. At this late hour, the studio had long since been shut, and these three friends were alone inside. These three friends had very interesting names. The spider was simply called PR, after the initials of the famous master engineer, Peter Rice, the British master engineer, Peter Rice. It was common in these parts to be called by one's initials, JRD for one, or CK, or VKRV. But importantly, the sound of the two letters P and R created an emotional resonance, a feeling of warmth in Papa and Mama Spider. Even without any vowels sandwiched in between, PR meant quite simply PR, or love in a local language. And he was absolutely true to his unusually constructed name. He loved his work, he loved his friends, and he loved life in general. It needed some imagination for his folks to come up with such a name, but he did full justice to it. Actually, it all started with the book The Engineer Imagines that PR's folks had seen in the architecture school library. They were thrilled that a spider's web was printed on the cover. Spiders, we all know, are the master builders of the insect world. They construct webs, what engineers call tensile structures, a structure that you can safely pull close to its limit, like a rubber band. Each web is a continuous work in progress, at once a home, a workplace, and a lair, which is like a den, a place where unsuspecting prey get entangled, providing food for the family. PR's friend the bat was called the prince. Unlike PR, who was always busy and silent, the prince emanated an eerie scream when he flapped his wings before taking off into flight. His ancestors had come from a faraway land of vampires. His was a spooky aura of Transylvanian mystique. The webbed structure of his body and his wings was quite unique. But both Pierre and Prince agreed that the third friend, the lizard, had the most artistic name, Cher. Her parents had once been to an exhibition of a Dutch graphic artist, M.C. Escher. They were impressed by the way he had introduced ideas of desolation into his work, using lizards, birds, and fish. Desolation is seamlessly fitting together of the same or different images, like a jigsaw. They liked the lizard so much that they decided to name their little baby Cher. Dropping the E and the S from Escher made the name sound so feminine, they beamed. In fact, someone at the exhibition had joked on seeing a black and white poo on the frame that one of the lizards might have left the drawing and become real. Well, it could have been Cher. Her father was at the time getting old and unable to control his poo. So they joked that little Cher was not born in the usual way, nature's way, but had emerged from a drawing. Now, how radical is that? An idea. Since Pierre and Cher came from teaching and artistic backgrounds, they were strong on the imagination. But of the three, it was the prince who was obviously the aristocrat. Even though at times, of course, he had to go and eat strange food. In the non human world, eating was not about taste alone, but importantly about survival. And each life form had their particular dietary preferences. Are humans listening? The spider and the bat were obvious choices to be reimagined in popular culture. The spider spun such beautiful structures to ensnare insects. And although he could quickly scale the tallest building, he could not fly. But his alter ego, Spider Man, who chased and ensnared villains in New York City, could. The bat, with his uber sensitive hearing, was quick to flight like Batman. With flapping wings and a fearsome looking mask, he screamed at villains playing dirty in Gotham City. This way, they were both able to keep their respective cities to some extent, both safe and clean. And very often, they did what law enforcement was unable to do. After all, they had supernatural powers of mobility. Now, coming back to the studio, Cher really was in awe of her two friends. So sharp and full of energy they were that poor Cher, a simple, often immobile creature, fell now and again into severe depressions. She didn't move a muscle for long periods, deep in thought. In comparison to them, but she couldn't even finish her sentence. It got to her, and she was down quite often. Why am I made this way? She moaned, ugly, lazy, and useless. But the two friends disagreed with her, and they were constantly cheering her up. For us, you are the Lizard of Oz, they said. You have a sleek and beautiful body, and such a strong voice, too. You look and sound so much like your namesake, the beautiful singer Cher. Surely you are the envy of the reptile world. Of course, it was true that both Pierre and Prince were rather ugly. Luckily for her, she was never asked to sing from The Wizard of Oz. That would have been painfully embarrassing. All that came out of her throat was cluck, 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 a deep staccato sound emanating from her delicate throat at irregular intervals. A mating sound, it was said. But Cher was conceived of a drawing, remember? The imaginary conception. The way she was said to be born made her very special for sure. But Pierre, the prince, and Cher had never followed popular trends. Ugly or pretty, dark or fair, it never mattered to these friends. Tonight's recounting of the day's event was about what Pierre and Cher had seen and heard this morning. It was the final jury of a junior design studio where students had to present their final projects. It seemed that something in it had upset Pierre no end, and he had to get it off his tiny chest. The extent of human ignorance and arrogance, they told the prince, was limitless. The project being discussed was a sports facility in which the structure of the roof was the main design element. The young students were understandably nervous, as this was their first exposure to independent thinking. All was made ready for the presentation. Drawings pinned up on movable panels and cardboard models of projects on stools. Some even used 3D walkthroughs to simulate the experience of being inside the building. The students, for a change, had done a lot of work. The jury had started on a wrong note. The very first student grilled by one of the jurors. He had even faulted her on her choice of words, implying she didn't even know or understand their meaning. It was sad to see because the poor girl's morale was being broken. Defend as she might her ideas, the juror said she hadn't done enough research. Had she checked the bird's nest in China, the hills-inspired work in the anthills-inspired work in Africa, the work of a Spanish engineer? It went back and forth for a while. Another juror pitched in to relieve the situation. One should desist, she said calmly, from bringing preconceived ideas or images into the proceedings. She felt the girl's project to have considerable originality and value. This was a surprising turn of events, a contrarian position being aired. A good sign, this argumentative, discursive culture amongst jurors. After all, we know that good ideas are tested to the voicing of different, of opposing opinions. This gave the student some courage to continue. Her project was inspired by a spider's web, she said, structurally a most beautiful form in nature that has inspired designers long before Leonardo da Vinci. PR, the spider, was almost directly on top of the proceedings, and what he heard made him turn pink with pleasure. If only that girl was Spider-Woman, he wished, but he wished in vain. PR's little heart and brain warmed with understandable pride. To be acclaimed by one and all in a design studio, he almost cried. At that moment, Cher was so excited about the good things being said about her friend that she accidentally let go some black and white poo, just like her father had some years ago. It was quite a blob, and it landed directly on a table where the bottles of water and notepads were kept. Looking up, the jurors and students were amazed to see not just the offending lizard, but a large spider as well, dangling on a thread. Amazed because it seemed as if the poor, harassed girl had staged it all. A piece of unfolding architectural theater with an unlikely hero, a spider. This surely couldn't be a coincidence, but of course it was. Emboldened and gaining confidence by all this, the girl brought to attention the most beautiful web that PR had woven between the studio rafters. It was large and taut, and he must have worked on it for over a week. She then began to explain what her project was all about. It was, she said again, inspired by that web, not a replica of it, a light, almost floating structure that was anchored only to a few supports. It could take loads far in excess of its own weight. It did a lot with very little, and so it was efficient and sustainable, two qualities essential for our survival. PR, who was listening with rapt attention, now thought it time for him to share his wisdom. Not often was he the center of attraction, but today was his day. My folks, he stated in an almost inaudible murmur. I think I'll say that again. My folks, he started in an almost inaudible murmur. The students and jurors had to stand to hear him. They had been following the work, he continued, of both Peter Rice and more recently that of Cecil Balmont, both very inspired and imaginative engineers. They would have both decried the bird's nest because it did no justice to the real thing. It was the work of a bloated ego, together with its use of bloated steel. It is now abandoned, like so many projects that were ill-conceived by star architects. It was a wasteful, huge mass of metal ready for the scrapyard. It would have been useful to mention the project done elsewhere for the same purpose almost 4 decades earlier, one that also took its inspiration from our webs. This girl had shown maturity far in excess of her age. She seems to have fused the ideas contained in that project with what was designed years later for an international trade fair project on a waterfront, both expressing large ideas with apparently very little material, both classic examples of architecture that is respectful of the dwindling resources of our planet. In one word, sustainable. Bravo. The jury and students fell silent. PR's use of the word our really jolted them. You could hear Cher clear her throat, and not her bowels again, thankfully, before letting out her strong sounds of approval. Three of them. Cluck, cluck, cluck. Was this a jury hijacked by the reptile and insect kingdom? Or was it just another Animal Farm sort of story that also included some humans? How elegantly they all felt the spider had made a case for the engineering systems the girl had deployed. Thereafter, one could have said that the jury had enlarged by one member, with everyone much more receptive to and respectful of what the students were presenting. It was very much out of a futurist saga, with not just one big brother watching from above, but two, one vocal, one quiet. No doubt, this episode also gave the other students much needed confidence and belief in their own work. The jury concluded on a very positive note. But that night, the prince, listening intently, had to have the last say before leaving, the closing lines of wisdom. Although silent up to now, one could sense the air thickening with anticipation. Opening his wings and in an imaginary embrace, he said to the other two, "Look at me, a mammal, but bird-like at the same time. Feet, hands, and wings, not separate, but conjoined. A structural continuum like no other. A creature made horror-like in some myths and legends, but in the most important one, Batman, a dashing hero of Gotham City. And how different the three of us are, PR, Cher, and me, the prince. But not better or worse, but just different. It is this difference, this diversity of creation that is so appealing, so necessary. We all coexist with our multiple views of the world, each having a specific purpose in the wider world, in the cosmic master plan. And the more the diversity, the more the excitement. It was interesting to listen to the unfolding drama this morning and how you two were able to be part of it, thanks to Cher's uncontrollable digestive system. Each of those students' ideas represented their own unique understanding of the program, and they must have all gone away with much gained. For one, that the architectural domain isn't only in the human sphere, it is shared with all other living organisms, whether on and in the earth, in the waters, or in the sky. Lots to reflect upon and to learn from and respect other species, he concluded. And so it should be in all schools of architecture. Independent thinking and experimental ideas should take center stage, be given a free rein, ensuring that students create their own unique views of the world, brave new worlds that will come into existence only if imagined well before their time, and always with the well-being of our planet in mind, its land, its air, and its waters. But only then will that well-being be transferred onto us. That will be the story of our survival. So that's the end of the second fable. So now I would, before I finish, I just want to tell you about this book of Intact that I spoke of before I started, which is called Bangalore Stories for Children. So it's a much longer one that I've given them. It's called The White Owl Who Saw Red. And I'm not going to read it because I think my time's up. But I just want to read this, the first verse, how those things starts. It's about the bird life and how they run parallel to the human endeavor of conservation. The story is about conservation because, of course, it's for Intact. Imagine an owl and a crow as best friends. Why not? Changing times, changing trends. but others will go peck peck with their beaks at those they consider alien or worse, freaks. So that was just a teaser of the intact book. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Edgar. That was absolutely fascinating. We have time for questions. Do post your questions in the Q&A box and we will call upon you to ask them directly.
Or you can put your hands up and we can
Hands up.
you on, ask your questions directly.
Yeah. The first question is from Adil. Adil, can you unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask if we can get the recording.
Yes, you can get the recording. It will be up on YouTube, on our page. Yeah. Since you're registered for this event, we will send you the link as well.
Okay.
Okay. Deepa.
Hi, Edgar. It's so wonderful to
Hi,
hear
Deepa.
this.
Nice to see you outside the studio.
I know. Amazing. I just want you to tell us how you came up with this idea and how you went about developing the plot. It'll be nice to listen about the process.
Yeah. No, like I said to BIC when they asked me about this project, I would say, I told them, going back almost 3 decades in time, when my son was just 5 years old, I think, or 6, we were in a car. And I was just trying to provoke him, to see whether he sees, the outside, the same, in his own way at buildings. So I just put this across to him. I said, look, Chots, I used to call him. In fact, I still call him that. His name is Rahul. I said, Rahul, what do you think of that building? We were at a traffic junction. And he just looked at it and continued to do what he was doing and said, they are trying too hard. When I heard that, I said to myself, good God, even at that early age, children are sort of aware of the environment. They're aware, they make a critical appraisal. And all kids are like that, but we don't realize it. So that's the time I said, hey, this is something that I have to develop upon. And then it took, 30 years for me to once again get into it. And as I said at the beginning, it was getting the ogre that ate children, as well as, that wonderful book of Alice in Wonderland, that made me say, look, I have to do it. So I've written on 5 of them. 2, of course, you heard. The third one is on conservation, the white owl that sees red. And there's one on construction, and one is set into the very distant future. It's absolutely this, dystopian. I'm enjoying it.
And tell us a little about the illustrations. They were beautiful, especially the second one.
Yeah, the thing is that, let me put it to you like this. I've been trying to do illustrations for the book. And then I was not satisfied with what I was doing, And then I went to the student that I spoke. Did you start from the beginning?
I think I missed the first 5 minutes, maybe. I just started with the ogre. Yeah.
Okay. So I was teaching a student in the 3rd semester, which we are doing now. And he showed an incredible propensity for, for a very free moving hand, fluid, and imagination as well, to match. So I asked him, I said, look, are you interested in doing this? Maybe you'll make some pocket money and things. So I first asked him to do the ogre, and his 2 things of groggy and moxie are absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
The thing is that I said to myself, hey, should I actually put in some other, illustrations? And I resisted for long, but those I've done myself.
Right.
You know me, I'm just dissatisfied. So they're going to be removed. But I needed it as a filler for this talk.
No, but I think they fit the stories phenomenally well. each on their own.
Okay, that's
So
good.
I would actually tell you not to remove your illustration.
Nice.
Thank you, Edgar.
Thanks for
Thank
coming.
you. Thank you.
you.
Next, we have a question from A.N. Prakash. So can
Oh,
you
hi.
unmute?
Prakash, that's wonderful.
Hi, Edgar.
Hey, Prakash. Hi, man. How are you?
I'm fine.
Yeah.
You just told that you are writing a book on construction.
Yes. I mean, a fable. One of the fables.
Fable.
Yeah,
Okay, I would be very much interested in reading that.
of course. Yes.
I'm just looking forward to that coming out.
Oh,
A book
great.
on construction from you would be interesting.
Just for people who don't know who A.N. Prakash is, I mean, I think he is the leading engineering firms that do also project management consultants for many years. And Prakash and I have worked together often in the past.
Including the Bangalore International Center.
Oh, wow, Prakash, my
Yes.
God. So you're part of the family.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Rajni, can you unmute and ask a question? Rajni, you'll have to unmute. Also, if there are any children in the audience who'd like to ask questions.
I have a question.
Yes,
I have a
please.
question. Yeah. Are these books on Amazon for sale, the books which you were reading?
No, I mean, as I said in my talk, they're going to be published in early next year, before March. So, but one of the stories, the one that I have not read, is going to be included in the book, the intact book of Bangalore stories, and it will be launched at the Bangalore Literary Fest on the 7th and 8th of December. That's about 2.5, 3 weeks. As I said, that's on conservation, and it's called The White Owl Who Sees Red. It's very important to find some provocative, catchy sort of titles, I mean, for fables.
In the meanwhile, thank you, Rajni, for that. We have, there's a comment from Vijay Lakshmi Nagraj who says, brilliantly crafted stories, the illustrations were superb, enjoyed them, thank you.
Oh.
There was one more person who raised their hands.
Vijay Lakshmi is a seasoned storyteller herself, and she's been at BIC several times before.
Oh, wow. Vijay Lakshmi, thank you. Coming from you.
Lekha, are there any more raised hands?
There are some questions about when the book is coming, when they're being published, which Edgar has already answered.
Yeah. Cool. I think we're done with.
Anyway, maybe I just speak a little. Do we have a little time?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes, we do. Yeah, we have 10.
I just like to speak, without a question being asked.
Right.
Sometimes, we just look at things around us, and we don't sort of take the time to stop and see. I like to make that differentiation. I mean, architects do, teachers do. Difference between looking and seeing, or hearing and listening. They're two very distinct modes of being, let's say. So, one of Leonard Cohen's songs, Bird on a Wire, is always something that intrigued me for long, until I started to write a fable that had humans and bird life running parallel, conserving one a tree, a very old tree, and the other a heritage building. So I was trying to understand, the thing goes like, what is it? I mean, like a bird on a wire, like a drunk in some midnight choir. I have tried in my way to be free. Now, very philosophical, but I was trying to understand, what does bird on a wire and even a drunk in a midnight choir really have to do with being free? I think that's a license of the poet. But I can imagine, then you start to see and to go deep into things. And I started to interpret it in a different way, because when you see a bird on a wire, if you ask a question, it's sitting there. Is there a purpose? Is it just looking at the world go by? Or is it experiencing some form of airwaves of, they sit on electric wires, they sit on fiber optic wires, they sit on telephone wires. Are they getting information? So one part of my story was that a particular species of birds sits on wires to tap the internet, to tap the cloud. So suddenly, you tell yourself, hey, a bird on a wire today means so much more, than what we imagine. So I think when you sort of stand, especially if you're on a morning walk, in a park, you see all of this. We don't seem to have too much time, to be able to do it. But I think when you slowly come to my age, that you can sit and, hey, look, and more importantly, see.
Thank you, Edgar. I think Vijayalakshmi Nagaraj would like to ask you a question. She just commented. Vijayalakshmi, can you? Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Firstly, I would like to compliment you on your brilliant story. And exactly what you were just talking about, birds on the wire.
Yeah.
My recent book has been Listening to the Sounds of Nature for children. I write for children.
Yeah.
And your observation, strangely, even I would always think that the birds are watching clouds and there's some message there. So I would like to ask you, your books which are going to be out early next year,
Yeah.
would they be both for children and for anyone, or across the board for?
No, it's across the board. You see, the thing is that because it is specifically addressed to the profession or the discipline of architecture,
Okay,
it becomes just, I try my best not to become too technical,
right.
because, that's why I've said 12 plus,
All right.
But, well, I mean, as I said right in the beginning in my introduction, I
Yes.
mean, fables we think are for children, but I
No,
think they are much more soothing for adults,
absolutely, absolutely. couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
in fact, I always think that as a storyteller, I can bring that story down to all levels.
yeah,
And what
yeah,
you have so beautifully put across would
mm,
really appeal to children.
yeah,
Even the spider, the lizard, the bat is something
yeah,
which relates very well in stories
yeah.
with children. Thank you
You
so much,
know,
Edgar. I learned
Vijayalakshmi,
so much from your story.
okay, great. We all know of these, the most popular and profound sort of Indian fables, the Panchatantra. I mean,
Absolutely.
it's all about, it's about crocodiles, monkeys, rabbits, lions, and fish. And, it's actually quite something, And actually, even the content, something is, how do you make friends? How do you lose friends?
True.
Acting without thinking,
Yes.
loss, gain, crows and owls. I was particularly happy about that crows and owls, because my
Absolutely.
intact story is precisely about crows and owls,
Yeah.
how they were such good friends.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for.
And next question is from Rajnandini Shaw.
Thank you for the reading. I am a literature student at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And as you would know, I am being a literature student. I have been struck by the architecture of the buildings here.
Yeah.
I just want to ask that how would you like to um, think of and seeing and imagining, because I think being an architecture and yourself and writing a book for children, I think you have your own certain ideas of and seeing and imagining. So what would you like to say about that?
See, in every country, in every city, there are good buildings and there are mediocre buildings. There's architecture generated with a lot of passion, and there's architecture generated through, perhaps if I may use the word, indifference. Every city. I mean, so the few years that I lived in Europe, everybody judges those the buildings by what they see in magazines. But my God, what about the buildings that don't appear in magazines? So it's actually almost a common denominator. So when one is sort of trying to make some sort of critical appraisal of your discipline, then it's really interesting to see it from the eyes either of children or through the eyes of the natural habitat, birds, animals, insects, termites, whatever they may be. So you have a way in which you get another view of the world. And without naming anything, one has to make that counterpointing, between what is good and what is not. Because the ogre, Groggy, he went about through the help of his sister Moxie to go only at buildings that were indifferent to the city. And they left the buildings that were done with a lot of passion alone. So it's not for me to say as some sort of a critic that this building is good or that building is bad, unless asked for. But it's just a general statement that, hey, Moxie felt that her thing was going to dogs, and therefore she needed to do something about it. It came from an invisible ogre. And at the end, I say, was this real? Was it hypnotically induced? Was it the founder of the city setting out something because he's afraid that the city is going to pieces? So it's working at various layers, in different layers. So as an architect, I know the depth of sometimes despondency as far as architecture is concerned, because it's extremely difficult. And one thing that I myself have said at the end, that you have to include yourself, because the ogre tapped at my door and it was quite a blow. So it's not about pointing fingers. It's about, the generality of the situation that we are in. Does it answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's a good segue to our last question for today. This is a question from Uma Moses. Do you see an intersection of poetry and architecture? A lot of architects that I've encountered, including you, seem to have a propensity for the verse.
For the?
Verse.
Word. Okay.
V-E-R-S-E, verse.
Okay, verse, okay. Yeah. One of the books that I mentioned that has really inspired me, even my grandchildren, I read it to them, is, Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. And what's so nice about that book is that it, like I said at the beginning, it distorts reality. It distorts time. It distorts space. But it also takes breaks, if you look at the book, and gets into poetry. And not just one verse, it gets into 5, 6, 7 verses. But of course, when I have to talk for 35 minutes, then, I have to just have bullets, for verses. But I think, okay, the poetry is very direct. It might not be profound. But, I think I always feel that the ultimate is poetry. So architecture must be poetry, music must be poetry, dancing must be poetry. The poetics of every discipline, that's what we call, is what we must attain.
Thank you so much, Edgar. One can't help but feel envious of the children who will get to discover these stories at a young age. What an inspired philosophical approach to locating architecture in its rightful relevance and expanse. here's wishing we have a new and inspired crop of architects and citizens. Thank you for your fables, Edgar.
Thanks, Raghu. It's nice, generous words that you've said. Thanks for inviting me to share my stories.